And it may well be that we see these leading edge use cases come out of Africa first, whether it's the blood delivery that we've already seen in Rwanda, or dairy herd services, or agricultural services. So I think watch the African space. Those companies that are global may want to come and invest in Africa to understand how that's working out.
You're listening to the Drone Radio Show podcast, the show about drones and the people who use them for business, fun, and research. Hosted by Randy Goers.
Hello, everyone. This is Randy Goers, and welcome to the Drone Radio Show podcast, episode 210. Can drones fulfill a critical transportation need in isolated areas of Africa? Today's guest believes they can. Edward Anderson is a Senior Innovation Policy Specialist at the World Bank's Global ICT Unit. Since 2014, he has been based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, where he represents the World Bank on Technology and Innovation. As part of his role, he leads work supporting the government's Open Data Initiative and is responsible for designing government modernization products in UAV mapping, citizen data, microwork, and smart sensors. According to World Bank estimates, Africa needs to spend $38 billion more each year on transport infrastructure, plus another $37 billion on operations and maintenance to sustain its current levels of development. Only 34% of Africa's population is within 2 kilometers of an all-weather road. To address this critical need, the World Bank is sponsoring the Lake Victoria Challenge, an ambitious project that aims to explore drones as a new mobility model for the hard-to-reach rural communities of the Lake Victoria region of Tanzania. In this episode of the Drone Radio Show, Edward talks about the Lake Victoria Challenge and what it means to the future of Africa. But before we hear from Edward, I want to thank those of you who are supporting my funding campaign. Now you have the option of making a one-time donation in any amount by going to droneradioshow.com/donate. Whether it's $1, $100, or much more, you can help defray the cost of production and keep the podcast going and growing. And if you'd like to make a monthly contribution, you can still go to patreon.com/droneradioshow. So let's learn how Tanzania is working to address mobility issues with drones. Let's pick up the interview where I asked Edward to introduce himself.
My name is Edward Anderson. I'm a Senior Disaster Risk Management Specialist for the World Bank. I'm based in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And I advise governments primarily around urban resilience, but I also have a history working on technology and innovation for the World Bank and advising on LeapFrogging opportunities and strategies, adoption of technology for core development objectives, mostly facing government services. So smart cities, early warning systems, risk assessment, these kinds of projects.
Because Africa is still very much a developing country, what does the introduction of smart growth concepts and technology offer?
It's really about doing more with less to some extent, efficiency and effectiveness of service delivery. It's also about sort of crowding in atypical partnerships and investment opportunities, leveraging citizens as co-creators, if you like, of public services in cities. And I think the core challenge in Africa, in particular in the cities, besides the infrastructure and the financing gap, is the pace of urbanization is really unprecedented when you think about how informal and potentially quite vulnerable it is. You have 2/3 of urban citizens today live in slums in Africa or in an unplanned community. So there's a huge challenge of how do you manage what you don't measure. If it's unplanned, it's usually sprawl. It's often not digitized on any of the sort of formal maps or master plans. And so there's really huge pent-up demand to find different ways to map, digitize, and action information that is way more current about these fast-changing neighborhoods. So it's both the frequency of the updates and the ease of access to the data. And that's where I think a lot of smart city programs in Africa are a lot about bottom-up creation of digital products, rather than the sort of traditional model of coming in with a surveying team from abroad every 5 years. If you're cities are growing at 5% per year. You have neighborhoods that are already growing at 10, 20% a year. And those neighborhoods are doubling every 4 years. So that's really a big challenge.
Can you tell us about the Lake Victoria Challenge and how it came to be?
As the name implies, it's a technology challenge that's really focused on the enabling environment for drones, both cargo delivery as well as surveying and mapping in Africa at large. And it started because I think there was a sort of plethora of pilot projects in the last 3 to 4 years that have piqued the interest of different agencies and governments, as well as, I think, a very groundbreaking commercial service in Rwanda, which is pioneered both in agriculture with a company called Charis UAS and in blood delivery with a US company called Zipline. And the fact that this was a commercial contract signed by an African government already for high frequency delivery of blood and now expanding into medical commodities, I think really kind of made drones a reality, that this is no longer some far-flung technological fantasy, but it's here today, and it's really an opportunity to be seized, part of a 21st century fourth industrial revolution, if you like, that governments can harness. So with the interest having been stimulated, what we really see is a big knowledge gap in how to take the next step. If a government is inspired by what's going on with drones in a neighboring country and they want to replicate that, you really run into regulation as being a really important theme. I think right now there's fewer than 15 countries in Africa with formal drone regulations. And those first drafts themselves, if you like, are not necessarily fit for African use cases. They tend to be replicas of other civil aviation authorities from around the world that might take a very risk-adverse view of drones without necessarily the same opportunities that you would have in Africa. So I think Lake Victoria Challenge is trying to look at that enabling environment of stimulating performance-based progressive regulations that are centered around African market use cases, particularly in the rural economy and linkages between urban and rural corridors. So it's looking at relatively high frequency services. It's looking at about 2 to 3 years into the future, so fairly near term, drone capabilities that might be in the prototyping stages now that are coming to market in the next 12 months. Across the whole range of technological solutions, so not just battery electric, but also heavy lift, gas hybrids, fuel cells. We're agnostic on the technology. What we're really looking at is how do we transition from a pilot project to a high frequency service that has real impact in rural Africa? And what will those use cases be in Africa that are likely to grow quite dramatically and quite differently to the rest of the world? So there's an analogy here with mobile phones over landlines, this leapfrogging opportunity, that if you have fairly challenged analog infrastructure, in the case of mobility, we talk about the rural access of all-weather roads is quite limited. There's about 35% of the population in Africa live within a 15-minute walk of an all-weather road, whereas in East Asia, it's 90%. So if you're facing that kind of challenge, then the ability to kind of go straight into lower sky, drone corridors, drone ports, e-commerce delivery from autonomous electric vehicles is potentially a huge opportunity. And you see sectors such as health commodities, the health supply chain, pioneering this, but it can be much broader. It could be agricultural goods and services. It could be the movement of cash between mobile money agents as float. We're looking at seed, the artificial insemination of dairy cows, for example. That cold chain for semen is actually really important, and it's a huge market. There are millions of doses per year per country. And one of the real constraints on the productivity of the dairy industry in Africa is the quality of the herds, and the access to good genetic material really isn't the same as you find in Europe. So in Europe, you have an 80% fertilization success rate for when a vet conducts an artificial insemination on a cow. In Africa, it's 20 to 25%, and it's really down to the quality of the delivery and the cold chain. So these are the kinds of markets that we think in Africa will materialize that maybe are not necessarily opportunities in the industrialized world where you already have good logistics on the surface.
What sort of distances are you talking about?
I think this is what we need to sort of engage in a little bit of an iterative discovery process. What's the right middle mile? Is it the last 100 kilometers? Is it the last 50? So 2019 is the first year of a competition for Lake Victoria Challenge. And for a variety of reasons, we'll be hosted on the Lake Victoria southern edge in the city of Mwanza. So for safety reasons, we do want to limit a little bit the kinds of drones that will be allowed to fly competitively to below 25 kilos and to being battery electric. But already that class of drone technology is capable of 100 kilometers in the hybrid configuration, the fixed wing with vertical takeoff capabilities. And then sort of the payloads, we're talking about 1 kilo to 5 kilos. But we see it as a little bit of a proof of concept. I mean, you will find gas-powered hybrids that can do several hundred kilometers. And of course, if they're not necessarily vertical takeoff and landing, you can have endurances with petrol engines and fuel cell engines that go into a dozen hours or so. But I think the sweet spot we're really looking at the moment is rural facilities that are hard to reach, that are within between 20 and 80 kilometers from a urban hub. And what's the catchment of population and facilities, and what's the frequency of flights? And we're really looking at a service provision that is a minimum of 5 flights a day for a particular route. So that's a somewhat arbitrary threshold for higher frequency, but it gets us away from this notion of piloting what the drone can do towards really demonstrating what the service model needs to be. How reliable is it? How repairable is it? What's the crew that you need on the ground? What are really the delivery costs? And ultimately, I think questions that users have is the drone adoption is not a one-to-one substitute for the motorcycle or for the truck. It's somewhere in between a new mobility paradigm where you no longer have to build an airport or a motorway or a railway station in that far-off community in the long run. But in the short run, you can also potentially improve the uptime or performance of your rural facility because you can shift lumpy deliveries that might come monthly or quarterly over truck into like a daily delivery. So you have less storage requirements. If we're talking about vaccines or medicines in rural areas, you can manage a better sort of supply chain. You have fewer stockouts, less spoilage of liquid products like bloods for blood testing in the case of HIV/AIDS and malaria. Delivery of vaccines more efficiently because of the cold chain, things like that. So I really think the sweet spot is that simplification of the rural supply chain and the sort of the just-in-time delivery of hard-to-reach communities can improve service delivery and outcomes. And then as a byproduct, you might have, fewer emissions if you're going electric and reduced delivery costs as well.
Okay, so let's talk about the details of the Lake Victoria Challenge. What's actually involved?
The Lake Victoria Challenge as a brand is actually several things. It's primarily convening those decision makers that have the urgency and the mandate to develop the enabling environment. So it's really to focus on regulators in Africa, key logistical agencies, as well as mapping and surveying agencies of government that have the imperative to sort of shift gears and find a new paradigm. But by convening them around a symposium and an expo of cutting-edge technologies, we think one way to really energize the whole ecosystem is to have a flying competition as well. So the flying competition is just really one part of it. At the moment, it's focused in its first year on 3 different use cases: an emergency delivery of a single package with volume and weight parameters, and it's really a combination of, say, blood supply with some medicine and some spare parts. So you might imagine the scenario of a premature birth in a rural facility, and you need to support a neonatal incubator and a bleeding mother, for example. So can we move 10, 20 kilos within the next 3 hours, and how do we do that? Sample collection is actually really critical, especially in the Lake Victoria Basin, where you have quite high incidence of tuberculosis, malaria, HIV. And so the ability to provide diagnostic testing for citizens is really crucial. And getting those samples to labs in an efficient and fast manner is important. At the moment, about 28% of blood samples spoil because of the heat that the sample is exposed to as they are transported. So that's the second challenge. And then the third one is a surveying one, which is really about change detection of rural assets, buildings, roads, bridges, farms. And it's a mapping and autonomous change detection service that we're looking for. So we're designing with real-world users the details of the use case, because the prize we're looking for is partly a cash prize, but it's primarily a contract to do 300 to 500 flights as a sort of demonstration service for a real-world user agency that has committed some amount of its budget already. So we see this as the beginning of a sustainable service. If we get the parameters, the pricing, and the right teams and technologies all right, it might be the way to kind of unlock these markets and get to higher frequency flights. And as you can imagine, that requires quite a bit of proactive thinking and reform on the regulatory front and the drone traffic management front as well.
And it sounds like you've included regulators and government officials as well. Is this to help jumpstart the discussion on developing a framework?
Exactly. I mean, I think the challenge serves to inspire these agencies, but it also helps us think through, what does it really take to allow for the safe scale up of relatively high frequency flights? Do we need to restrict to limited drone corridors and drone ports? Can we adopt unmanned traffic management systems? And are these going to be national systems, private systems, multiple systems, or a single system? And I think no country in the world has really cracked this yet. And so having this formula of a sort of dialogue, a regional dialogue between regulators and users, co-located with then the entrepreneurs and the private industry doing the flying challenge and the expo, is a great way to bring everything together. It creates a lot of energy, attracts a lot of young people. I think it can be quite inspiring for some of these government agencies. And ultimately, what we really want to see is an Africa-centric definition of what is the future these countries want to see, and what's that implementation plan to get there. Drones is a global industry. To some extent, autopilots are being open sourced, and electronics are getting commoditized, and airframes can be 3D printed anywhere. But the operations, the business models are going to rely on local companies having access to global expertise, and national governments having a good idea of what they're buying and what they want. So it's enabling all of those pieces.
Is the drone sector well enough developed in Tanzania to sustain an effort like this? Or will it need an influx of companies and expertise from outside?
Tanzania is obviously the home base for 2019, but we're really trying to be representative of most African markets. And I think in most countries, there will be a need to grow both indigenous innovations and startups, as well as bring in international players that can partner or invest. All of these markets are pretty nascent. In some countries, drones are outright banned. In others, there's a lot of uncertainty with the regulations. They're in this sort of interim regime, and that makes it difficult to really invest in a business for the next 5 years or so. Tanzania was actually an early adopter, especially on the surveying and mapping. And you see some projects like the Zanzibar Mapping Initiative, which State University with the Commission for Lands in Zanzibar did, where they updated their national base map using very small drones, and they did about 2,500 flights to do that. So they have a lot of experience in terms of rural operations, working in the forests, on the beaches, in the dust, in the heat, swapping out batteries, managing and processing data. And I think that that's really inspired them to dream quite big. When it comes to cargo delivery, Tanzania's only just started experimenting. There's a project with DHL and German development technical agency GIZ that have been supporting a team called Wingcopter, and they've been running some trials. But I think really Rwanda is the leader in Africa when it comes to the cargo delivery because of its blood supply contracts with Zipline. And you see them now starting up, signing a deal with Ghana. So we expect that more and more African countries are getting switched on to the opportunity and becoming quite interested. And I think Tanzania, as an ecosystem, has a lot of young pilots that are quite eager to find, jobs in this fourth industrial revolution. I don't necessarily see Tanzanian startups designing and building their own cargo drone, but I do see them coming up with a business plan to operate a logistical route or service that, could be served by a drone that might be manufactured in China or Europe or the US. So there's an opportunity there, to find local pilots, to find local business customers, supply chain oriented types of businesses that would be quite eager for drones.
Tell us about the symposium. What sort of topics do you think will be covered?
So we actually ran last year. We called it year 0 because it was a bit of a proof of concept. So had a relatively modest budget, and we tried to do an invitation-only event, capping it at 150 people, but it was already oversubscribed. So we ended up with 280 people coming. And the purpose was to really test the waters and tweak the formula. And I think we validated this combination of regulatory track. So we had 9 civil aviation authorities from across Africa, mixed with logistical agencies looking at, medical stores department, post office, different transport ministries. And then we had the technology track, which was introducing drones and drone traffic management systems. So I think we're looking to blend something similar. We had also an infrastructure track, which was looking at the drone port typology and, what the business model for drone ports were. So my expectation is that in May, June, the initial program for 2019 will be announced, and registration for tickets will be opened. And we'll have something similar where there'll be these different thematic disciplines run as tracks: infrastructure, technology, regulations. And as the strong cross-cutting one will be the user agencies and logistics and mapping. And the symposium runs concurrent with an expo. And the expo will be both for African startup businesses and companies with an idea, a business plan for using drones, as well as global industry players that have offerings in UTM, in software, in drone delivery or drone mapping services. And within the expo, we hope to be able to get some permits to do air displays as well as static displays. But the venue will be very close to the Mwanza airport. So it'll all be run in tight coordination with the Civil Aviation Authority and the Airport Authority, but there won't be that many slots for air displays. So it's primarily a symposium and expo. The actual flying competition will be run off-site the week before, with the winners announced during that expo.
When is the event scheduled?
It's scheduled for December 3, 4, 5 of 2019 in Mwanza, Tanzania, which is on Lake Victoria. It's a beautiful venue. It allows us to do some interesting things because it allows us to show beyond line of sight flights in Class D airspace using a state-of-the-art unmanned traffic management system. Most of the flights, well, actually all the flights will be over water, but close to the shore, able to fly close to an airport, close to the city, and yet reaching a collection of hard-to-reach communities that are representative of the much broader population demographic of the Lake Victoria Basin, which is, in fact, the most densely populated part of the world, with a very youthful population, a burgeoning cash export economy. So we think that if commercial services become viable anywhere in Africa, that geography of the Lake Victoria region is likely to be one of the first markets to see this emerge. Of course, it depends on more factors than just the demand side. It depends on regulation. But we think that demand will be quite strong in terms of rural services for drones along the shores of Lake Victoria and through its islands.
In light of the goals of the Lake Victoria Challenge, will the regulations need to be changed to allow that type of activity to continue in Tanzania?
I think the regulations will certainly need to evolve. They always do as the technology evolves. And it's not really clear yet what those use cases really are and what that operating model becomes. I think governments are rightly worried about how do they manage this whole airspace if you're going to have thousands of robots flying around, So at the moment, regulations have tended to manage drones by limiting their activities, at least historically, globally. They've created these categories. So the open category is really treating drones a little bit like hobbyist toys. You can fly line of sight during the daytime below 400 feet away from people and houses. And it's not really built for the core use cases that government has, which is predominantly going to be, building surveys, flood risk and situation mapping over cities, or anti-poaching for wildlife requires nighttime flights and longer distances. Certainly postal delivery, medical delivery will be beyond line of sight flights. So these use cases require much more nuanced regulations and what we call a sort of specific operational risk assessment type of approach. What is the risk? How do we design to a certain acceptable risk level rather than a kind of blanket use case, especially considering how quickly the technology is evolving. And then the second element is, drone traffic management. Air corridor management is quite a new topic that I think most of these civil aviation authorities have not been exposed to and certainly aren't expert in yet. And as they become more familiar with these technologies, we'll see maybe different ways to regulate and possibly even monetize the lower skies, where you could auction routes and slots and spectrum. And that's really important. To date, really the clients for civil aviation authorities are airports and airlines, and their main concern is protecting the safety of passengers and aircraft. So with drones, we need to also try and put a bit of a value on the potential social benefits of those markets, as well as also non-airspace risks, right? There's cyber hacking, there's data privacy, there's wildlife interactions. These are things that typically are not even covered in aviation regulations for drones. So we do need to also have a knowledge base around that.
So the challenge is in December. What's happening between now and then?
So, just working backwards, the first component we're really pushing at the moment is registrations for teams that want to fly for the 3 use cases that are advertised as the challenge. And there's a 2-step process. One is quite a broad registration focused on have you got the right technology and the right skill set. So it's the VTOL electric systems. And we're looking for startups or teams that want to get into the African market that can demonstrate a fairly high degree of professionalism. So this is not going to be a sort of hobbyist design and build team coming along with something that's not flown before. We need to see that it's flown, that there's some experience with beyond visual line of sight flying. Stage 2 will be more focused on the specific use case requirements, which are designed to both stretch a little bit the technology, particularly on the operations side, but also to align with real world users so that we are attracting the kinds of teams that we know clients on the ground want to see. So that stage 1 actually closes on April 25th, I believe, in about a week's time. And then those teams that are on the long list will get shortlisted and will receive a second proposal with a lot more details on the use case. And there'll be a more in-depth application process, and there'll be a lot more Q&A opportunities. And we're expecting to select between 3 and 5 flying teams per challenge, although teams can register for more than one challenge. So probably around 10 teams in total that will be selected as finalists that will get support to travel to Tanzania, ship their equipment, conduct some tests, and then participate in the flying competition in Mwanza in the last week of November, and then continue for the symposium and expo where winners will be announced and where everybody will get to exhibit as well. So we think that a key part of the incentive will be the visibility, the networking opportunity, and the chance to show off really what each team's sort of uniquely capable of doing. So hopefully all teams will gain quite a lot from it. And ideally 3 out of those finalists will also receive a service delivery contract that will start in January 2020. So, the incentives, while there may be a cash component to the prize, there's also a contract component. And we're negotiating at the moment with local agencies to do the co-financing of those contracts. We will be announcing shortly who those agencies are and more details on the contract. So this should be attractive if a team was looking to get into the African market anyway. And really what they're winning is a big head start in what might be the birth of a sort of new industry in Africa. But the total value of these contracts is around £100,000 for a few months of service demonstration.
It sounds exciting, especially for the company that wins the challenge and receives the service contract. For them, it almost assures that they're the leader of that particular drone service delivery.
Right. I mean, they still have to demonstrate quite a lot on the safety technology side, as well as conform financially to the right fit. And that's where we're iterating a little bit. We don't want to get too premature with the technology or too ambitious, but it does also want to stretch, I think, what the state of the art is today. So it may well be that the biggest value is simply bringing all of these different agencies together and stakeholders. And it's a huge opportunity for the drone industry to promote its benefits within African leadership. You know, we saw the African Union last year issue a executive council, I think, issued a communique urging member states to adopt drones as an emerging technology for agriculture. And I think the Lake Victoria Challenge will be a showcase where you can really see the full range. It's not just about precision agriculture in terms of mapping, but we can have crop testing, seed delivery, dairy herd insemination, delivery of genetic material. We could look at e-commerce, at spare parts. So there's very broad potential in the rural economy, and the question of what's the right timeline for these markets to open up. And I think LVC wants to accelerate a transition to that future.
We've talked about the value of the Lake Victoria Challenge to the competitors, but can you share more about the value of the competition to Tanzania and to the broader African continent?
This is really trying to respond to fragmented demand for knowledge, for services, for access to drone technology. And the value to a country like Tanzania is the ability to kind of bring it all together and get different agencies on the same page about how do we evaluate this opportunity? What's the cost-benefit rationale we're using? Is this about saving lives in hard-to-reach areas? Is it about avoiding future infrastructure costs by building out smarter logistics? Is it about saving money over existing delivery networks by going electric and going aerial? And I think that there's quite a bit of knowledge to be developed there. And so primarily this is a awareness building and sort of consensus building approach to what the right strategy is to adopt drone technology. Of course, part of that is to bring in, security and military guys who are going to worry about risks, the civil aviation guys about the regulations, but all together in a conversation centered around your own national use case opportunity. So we're not talking about delivering pizzas in, Dallas, or, Project Wing is delivering coffees in Australia. We're really looking at what's a sort of urgent need in Africa today that will drive this. And how far away is that? We think that the battery electric drone technology on a sort of delivery basis is competitive with motorcycles in some fairly densely populated rural areas already today. But a lot of assumptions have been made about that delivery model, that operating model. On paper, the physics of electric drone delivery suggests that the price comes down substantially. But how do you kickstart the industry, and how do you get investment to arrive? So I think the countries who have piqued their interest, maybe they've dabbled, they've started one or two pilot projects, but now they're not sure how to scale up, will find the expertise available as really the key value proposition in terms of implementation support, for tendering services, for evolving regulatory frameworks. I think the next bit is they'll also learn from each other, right? I mean, if we want to convene, we're looking to convene about 25 African government civil aviation authorities. So they can learn from each other as regulators, but they can also learn from their own national logistical champions, from their post offices who've maybe got a plan, and have very practical conversations about how do we make this a reality. So that's primarily, I think, the government motivation. And then finally, I think they can be inspired by some of their own entrepreneurs and business people coming into the expo, pitching ideas and showing what's possible.
And for my final question, Edward, what message would you like to leave listeners about drones in Africa and the opportunities?
Well, I think that, we should see Africa as a really interesting frontier market in different ways. Of course, the potential benefit of drones and their impact in Africa could be outsized compared to an industrialized world because of the deficits we see in mobility and in local mapping and surveying. So it can have a huge development benefit. But also, I think it can be a win-win in terms of the global industry to really study Africa, because we expect business models and use cases in Africa to evolve that may not naturally emerge elsewhere. So the analogy with mobile phones and mobile finance is that you saw mobile money really sprout up first in East Africa, and now it's really scaling up in places like Asia. And it may well be that we see these leading edge use cases come out of Africa first, whether it's the blood delivery that we've already seen in Rwanda or dairy herd services or agricultural services. So I think, watch the African space. Those companies that are global may want to come and invest in Africa to understand how that's working out. And it can be a win-win if countries are properly equipped with their cost-benefit framework, with their risk management understanding, and they know what they're looking for.
That's it for episode 210 of the Drone Radio Show. I hope you enjoyed hearing from Edward Anderson of the World Bank and learning about the Lake Victoria Challenge. I want to thank Edward for taking the time to speak with me. If you want to learn more about the Lake Victoria Challenge or want to connect with Edward, check out the webpage at lakevictoriachallenge.org. If you like the Drone Radio Show, please consider supporting the podcast with a small donation. The content is always free, but for as little as $1, you can help defray the costs of production. To donate, go to droneradioshow.com or patreon.com/droneradioshow. And thanks for listening. Your support means a lot to me, and I hope you'll listen to more episodes of the Drone Radio Show podcast to hear how others are using drones for business, fun, and research. For the Drone Radio Show, I'm Randy Goers.
This has been the Drone Radio Show podcast. More information on today's show can be found on our website at www.droneradioshow.com. If you're using drone technology for business, fun, or research and would like to share your experience on the show, please visit our website and fill out a guest appearance application. And don't forget to follow us on your favorite social media channels.